All right. So to kind of kick it off, um, I'm going to give us a little bit of a grounding in um, what we are going to focus on tonight. And I'm going to kind of put a little few questions out to you, ask you to write in the chat, maybe do a different polling, and then we'll have Kira really share tonight about the power of story and how we talk about storytelling and personal connection at Climate Generation, and how you can translate that over into whatever you do if you are in the classroom or if you're in a non-formal educator or whatever audiences you work with, even if it's just with family and friends. We really want to empower you and give you the tools to have conversations about climate change and really make that personal connection. So we know it's important to make connections personally when we're talking about climate change, as well as the intersecting issues that we're dealing with right now, including the pandemic and racism. So when we can relate to people, when we can listen to them, when we can learn about their experiences, we really gain new perspectives and develop empathy, crossing the many divides that we see in our world. So making time and space for connections, we know, is really difficult to do when we can't gather in person. Um, but I know that you are all creative people and have probably figured out some really fun and interesting ways to do that, even in a pandemic. So I'd love for you all to share by going to actually this polling software called Slido. I don't know if you've used that before, but you can take either a new browser window or your smartphone and open up a browser and go to slido.com and enter in the number 9540. And my question for you is, how have you made space for connections during this time? Knowing that we're talking about personal connection, the need for us to really understand each other and make space for that. So if you can go to slido.com and enter in 9540, go ahead and just type your response in there and it should populate here on the screen. There we go. There's a few. So being outside with others and on my own, handwritten letters. Awesome. Prioritized a long visit to family rather than immediately finding a new job after being laid off. Nice, more time to see loved ones. Participated in River Stories event with local nonprofit. Joining virtual conversations like this one with others across the nation and the world. Yeah, I think this time has really made us realize that we kind of just have to slow down. Lots of walks, playing categories with adult children via FaceTime. Fun. That is what I have realized, that you can play categories virtually. That's a good idea. Going on walks, through Zoom meetings, FaceTime, connecting creatively, social distancing, a picnic and birthdays. Awesome. Occasionally meeting with close friends. Yeah, so a lot of time outdoors and a lot of time using technology. And I think that's what we can think about with how we can connect with maybe our students or with other people as well, is how do we get creative and really bridging that divide that we feel when we have to be social distancing. Awesome. I'm glad that worked out to take the poll. So I'm just going to touch on a few things that we know are really great ways to connect personally and really bring climate change into the humanities classroom or into anything that's going to involve art, literature, and storytelling and writing. So the first one I want to highlight is just using literature to support learning about climate change. So there are a lot of awesome climate fiction, or cli-fi, if you've heard of that term, or nonfiction books out there. Here's just kind of a snapshot of them. I know a lot of folks have used A Long Walk to Water. One of the newest ones we've read recently is The Marrow Thieves, which is a really great book. But we know that fiction is a really great way to help us live alternate realities. We can live our worst nightmares, we can live our highest hopes, we could go where science cannot go, and really galvanize society and think about how, things could be in a certain way. Also, literature on climate change helps us to see things like a mirror, but also like a window. So if you're thinking about how you're reading a book and maybe, how is this character like me? How did the actions affect others? And how would I react in a similar situation? Can I see myself in that? So is it a mirror? Versus, is it a window? How am I like the other? How are we all affected the same? How do we adapt? How are we able to see something new that we would normally not be able to see just in our own communities? And then really, it can also help develop hope and inspire solutions. So if we're learning about something maybe that's dystopian or utopian, or actual solutions, like in the book, The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind, which is a true story of a boy who built his own wind turbine in his community. So we actually have a climate fiction and nonfiction reading guide that has a long list of books. You can check this out on our website, and I'll send a link to you all as well. But they're all different age levels, so elementary, middle school, and high school. Just thinking about how, maybe some books you didn't really think were climate related, but they actually are. Like a classic, The Grapes of Wrath, actually can be a climate novel. So just thinking about how we can kind of reframe and look at literature and talk about climate change that way. We can also create art to connect to climate change. So we know that art can simplify things. Like this piece of art right here on the slide is actually what would be a global temperature graph of the rise in global temperature, but it's really simplified by having one line per year with the color. And I think it's really pleasing to look at, but also when you think about what it really means, it has really communicates a stark truth. Art can also be resistance. Art nurtures empathy, and art can inspire collective action. And looks like Betsy says that she's knitted climate striped scarves for people. That's awesome. And actually, here is a photo of a collective action that some people did here on the bottom right, where they knit the temperature change in 1 year in the location where they lived. And so that is I think however many years that is hanging up there, but you can see how it changed over time and how, each time they knit a row and what that means when thinking about how, other people are doing it at the same time and what can happen when you put it all together. So that's kind of fun. And then also this bottom left is a photo of some melting ice in Paris during COP21, where the Paris Climate Agreement was signed. And it's actually in the form of a clock. So there's 12 of them, and kind of just showing how time is running out, and the ice was melting, and kind of, I think, a really somber experience. But something like that, where it's an installation where you can actually kind of go through it and have an emotional connection. And this top one right here is a haiku. So it's big, fast carbon surge, ice melts, oceans heat and rise, air warms by decades. So that was just a haiku that was written by somebody who also did a watercolor of a graph. So just thinking about all the different ways that maybe, you are passionate about, or your students or people that you know, and thinking about how you can turn your creativity into communicating about climate change and really sparking conversations, and have it there for quite a long period of time, like something like this mailbox that is also art with looks like prairie grass, so that's pretty awesome. We also want to encourage respectful conversations on climate change. We're going to talk tonight about kind of some tips for communication and how we do make it personal. And this video that I linked here, the secret to talking about climate change, is by the Alliance for Climate Education. And I think it's just a really simplified video that talks about the secret, which is to listen. So the most important thing that you can do with climate change conversations is to listen. And I know that's hard for a lot of people, especially when we're very passionate about an issue, but really connecting with people and listening to them. And Kira's going to talk a lot more about that tonight. And then also just thinking about the literature, like I mentioned earlier, the climate fiction and nonfiction. We also want you to think about how you can decolonize your reading list. So thinking about how all the books on our shelves or the books that we are recommending our students to read, how many of them are written by people of color? Or how many of them celebrate different cultures? Or how many could be purchased from a Black bookstore? So thinking about giving the students the opportunity to choose books that they're interested in reading and that really reflect the current issues and events. So, you know, as teachers and as people, we're really charged with handling highly charged topics in the class. And you can really use books to teach about these hard topics. And you know, the students are really entering the classroom from the outside world. So we really need to help them prepare them for the world outside of the walls of your classroom. So just thinking how you can do that. And the last one is leveraging the power of personal stories. So knowing that we can make an emotional connection through a personal story is really essential to connecting with people on climate change. We know that we can not just talk about the facts, that hasn't gotten us far enough. So we have to really take this further and talk about our personal stories. So we have a storytelling lesson that you can use for the classroom, and I can link it here. That just basically walks you through some prompts to help you start thinking about your personal connection and what motivates you and what matters to you. So you can do that yourself and also with your students. And then also we have a book called Eyewitness, Minnesota Voices on Climate Change, which is a collection of personal stories of Minnesotans, and really, really beautiful artwork and kind of unique and inspiring perspectives on people of all ages and their connections to climate change. So I'll put a link to that project online. You can buy the book. Otherwise, there's a few audio clips of some people's stories in there, as well as artwork that you can check out online. And it's absolutely beautiful. So I'm going to pose another question to you all before we switch gears and let Kira tell us about climate change storytelling. But if you want to go to Slido again, go to slido.com and enter in the number 9540. My question for you is, how have you been thinking about climate change lately? So you can take this in any direction that you would like, but how have you been thinking about climate change lately? And I know that it can vary from day to day or week to week or minute even to minute. So just like to see where you all are at the moment. Or is it going through? for people? I'll just give another minute here. There we go. Hopeful for governmental changes led by new administration. Yes. There is hope in that. Thinking about micro changes, observing and changing habits. I teach K through 4 and I need to simplify the concepts. Yes. Working with my students to have them understand the importance of their contribution for change, for sure. I've been thinking about how to help my skeptical family members understand it. Yes, hopefully we can give you some tips tonight. How to teach my students about climate change appropriately and responsibly for being K through 5. Yes, definitely is a different conversation with younger students. How it intersects with racial and economic justice. Yes, we know it doesn't just stand alone. There's a lot that goes into it. California wildfires, definitely climate impacts. Those are on top of people's minds. Geopolitical. Think about plastics and school supplies and alternatives. Yeah. I mean, it's just multifaceted, and you can just tell from all these answers that there are so many different ways to think about climate change. Yeah, so thank you all for sharing. All right, well, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I can find that, and I'm going to turn it over to Kira, who is going to share with us about the power of story.
Thanks, Megan. All right. So I'm super excited to be able to talk about storytelling with all of you. It's absolutely one of my favorite parts of my job, and especially working with getting to hear stories from teachers and from students and from people on all aspects of the spectrum of talking about climate change is always wonderful. So I'm excited to talk a little bit about how we do that here at Climate Generation and ways that you can bring that into the classroom. But to start off, I just want to start by sharing a little bit about myself and my background. So I grew up on the East Coast in Boston, and I had a love for the ocean. I could look at tide pools for hours and hours. And this is a photo of me when I was a baby with my parents on the coast. And I was what first got me interested in wanting to study biology and to study the environment was the ocean. And when I moved to Minnesota a few years ago, I felt a real familiarity with the way that people in Minnesota connect to the Mississippi River and the lakes that are here all around the state. And that felt really familiar and really comforting. But I was also a really anxious kid growing up. And my mom would encourage me to write things down in a journal before I went to sleep at night to help me sleep better, to just sort of get all these feelings out there. And now that I'm older and I think about climate change and sort of all the things that are going on in our society right now, I found that sharing our stories and being able to sort of express ourselves through writing or through poetry, whatever your format may be, is a really powerful way for us to process anxiety and our emotion, feeling really charged and rooted in your community, and how, feeling that to take action. So I'm super excited to be able to hear from all of you today and dig in and hear some of your stories and how you might be able to bring this to your students' experiences as well. So to kick it off, I actually want to turn it over to everyone here, and I want to have you start thinking about your own personal connection to climate change, finding your own story and your own voice as a way to think about the issue. So it can sometimes be helpful to start by answering a question. So I'm going to pose, what motivates you to care about climate change? So if you want to think about it for a moment, and then you can go ahead and post it in the chat. And I'll give everyone a minute to do that. This could be what motivates you professionally, personally, traditions being passed down, faith, caring for the things that we love, children, both your own or children that you teach. That's wonderful. Feel free to keep posting those. Love with the underwater. I love that. So feel free to keep these in mind as we go through talking about storytelling today, because I think it's really important for all of us to sort of keep those motivations as we're thinking about our own connections to climate change and how we want to use that personal identity, that personal background to engage in solutions. So I'm going to start off just talking about why is it important for us to talk about climate change. So according to Yale's program on climate change communication, they do opinion polling, and it shows that nearly 70% of Americans understand that climate change is happening and that it will cause harm to future generations. Yet 2/3 of Americans say that they never talk about it. So we know that there is this disconnect between people feeling concerned about the issue of climate change, but not necessarily having the confidence to take action or to have conversations. And we know that talking about climate change helps us to build that confidence. It is, really like flexing a muscle to build strength. And it's a tangible action that we can all do to normalize conversations about climate change. We know that finding and sharing personal stories, personal narratives can really help us to sort of balance the science and bring in a human face to the facts and figures, really bringing that relevance to our lives with the issue. And for the storyteller itself, the act of sharing your own climate story with others can really help you identify why you care about the issue and help uncover your own motivation to do something about it. So just like you all posted your motivation for taking action on climate change in the chat, you can sort of keep that in mind with you as you maybe think about your own personal narrative. And for teachers like yourselves, for educators, it's an exercise that you can do with students to really help them fully understand how they can bring their own life experiences into action, into their narrative. And that really helps them build confidence talking about climate change in a way that matters to them, that feels important. And I think also it's important for us to hear students' experiences and to understand their lived experiences, because as a teacher, if your experience is very different from theirs, that can sort of help to bridge that barrier in a classroom setting, in an outside classroom setting too. Anytime you're building a relationship with someone, gaining that trust and gaining that personal relationship can really help to sort of take it to that next level and be able to break down those barriers to conversation. And studies show that youth who are taught about climate change in school actually really become critical messengers in influencing their parents and their own families. So sharing our stories of climate change can prompt listening and compassion, and can sort of ripple out beyond just your relationship with the students, but into their family and their community as well. And I think spreading that message of listening and compassion is definitely what the world could use a lot more of right now. So it's a really important aspect of it. And to just back up for a minute, when I say a climate story, what we mean by that is really a personal story about you and your experience of climate change, whether that's impacts that you've been experiencing, how you have been thinking about climate change recently, a story that you have heard from a family member or experienced yourself. There's a wide variety of ways that we can build out our climate stories, and probably all of us here on this call have multiple climate stories that we could share as well. And it's a story that is really descriptive and personal, and really builds that emotional connection to the issue. So to start off, I'm actually going to play an example. I'm just going to stop my screen sharing for a moment. And the example that I'm going to play is actually by an educator that we worked with up in northern Minnesota And he shared his personal story at an event that some of his students had put on for their community to talk about climate solutions. And so this is a clip of him sharing that on NPR.
NA member FDIC.
My name is Daniel Friedman. I'm an artist and educator living and working in northern Minnesota. My mom said I never stopped talking. I had some speech issues as a young kid, so I spoke without being understood for quite a while. And she said the only time I would stop talking is when she'd put me in a little kid carrier and take me out into the woods, which were behind our house. I mean, and this is something I experienced as a small child, and to this day, I think I love being in the woods because it immediately brings me back to that sense of awe and wonder, not only the greatness of it, but also the minuteness and how somehow I too am a part of this. There's no better cure for a broken heart than to go out in the woods and lay down on the forest floor and watch the branches and the trees sway with the wind. I suppose some people feel this way in church or temple. I've worked with young people a lot and trying to get them to understand the impacts of climate change. And I think we often use fear to motivate people to action. And I really wanted to think about what is it we're actually losing. The intimate relationship each one of us has with nature is a very powerful bond. And to me, that's how we're going to get people to think about climate change, is those personal connections, that deep connection we have with nature, and getting everybody to experience that.
That's ClimateCast this week. With thanks to Climate Generation, I'm NPR Chief Meteorologist Paul Huttner.
Support for ClimateCast comes from Bank of America.
All right, so that's just a really lovely example by Danny. So I'd love to just hear anyone's thoughts. If you want to just take a minute and paste in the chat, maybe one word that you're taking away from Danny's story, whether that's a feeling or an emotion that it brings up for you, or maybe an idea if it sparks something, thinking about ways that you could pull storytelling into your own classroom. Feel free to go ahead and post that in the chat now. Peaceful. Beauty motivates change. I like that. Okay. All right, connection to childhood. Oh, I love that about the waves on Lake Erie and how they have shared my joys and sorrows. It's beautiful. All right, so we know that storytelling is a really powerful tool because it really invites that deeper listening, that deeper understanding. And in the example of using that in the climate movement, for a long time, the way that we have talked about climate change has mostly been from a scientific perspective. I think maybe many of us or most of us can think about traditionally hearing about climate change in strictly a science classroom. But we know that while the science is essential, it's actually when we balance our stories with the science that we sort of help place these facts and figures into context. And for thousands of years, Indigenous cultures around the world have been making these observations and connections. And so it's important to note also that sort of science itself is a Western idea. And in fact, stories have really played a critical role in forming our cultural identity, our language, our spirituality, and just in understanding our relationships with one another and with the natural world, as Danny pointed out in his story as well. So I think when we sort of invite these other ways of knowing, we can really get a richer and a fuller understanding of these issues. And I know that for me, in my experience, hearing about climate impacts through stories really helps to bring that emotion into the issue and really bring that motivation to want to take action too. And historically, and in the present as well, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities have faced a disproportionate share of the impacts of climate change. and have often been excluded from the conversations and from the decisions on how best to address the issue. So we know that it's incredibly important to be able to amplify BIPOC voices through storytelling, and that really helps us get a better understanding of the issue and really center the communities that are facing the biggest impacts in our decision making, in our solution building for climate change. And so storytelling allows us to do that, to be able to share voices maybe that are outside of our own communities, and get a better understanding of that full picture. And we know, because we're all experts in our own experiences too, that storytelling is sort of, it can be an equalizer, allowing everyone to feel really confident in the conversation, and feel like their voice is a critical part. And for students who maybe, a lot of times young people don't feel like they can be part of the conversation because they don't have a degree, or don't have a full-time job, but we know that we really need everyone to be a part of this movement. And so I think storytelling can help sort of feeling that ownership in our what we have to say, and bringing that to the experience as well. And we know that information alone is not enough to shift behavior. So bringing sort of the head and the heart together is really what gonna help us shift these public narratives about climate change and climate solutions. So with that, I'm gonna play. I'm going to play one more example of a climate story, and this one is by a student that we worked with, and her name is Mira, and she shared her own story of climate action.
My name is Munira Burhi, and I'm a senior at Patrick Henry High School. Since I joined Climate Generation's Men Youth Leadership Program, I've been more educated on climate change and social justice altogether. I've never thought about climate change, if I'm being honest. It always seemed like a big task to just leave up to the politicians. I'm only a teenager. Men made me realize that was wrong. I visited my family in Ethiopia and Somalia during the summer of my freshman year in high school. It didn't click for me that my family struggled financially, not having enough money to buy food or clothing for themselves. My aunt would slaughter goats and sheep and make celebratory meals for us that were only for special occasions. Despite having very little, my family was still very grateful for all that they had. 2 years after my visit, a drought hit Somalia. Over 2.9 million people have been affected by the drought since 2017. There was a big famine, killing most livestock, including all of my family's animals. There was nothing to eat, only unclean drinking water to drink, and diseases like measles and cholera began to spread. My people were dying. I can't promise that this drought was due to climate change, but I know that climate change has played an influential factor in making weather more extreme. Because of our fossil fuel society, there will be more droughts, more floods, more hurricanes, not just in other places around the world, but right here too. My involvement in Climate Generation not only taught me that the little things I do matter, like talking to my friends about climate change. And I know I can do big things too. I organized a summit of 100 youth to meet with our governor and lawmakers to urge them to fight for climate justice, something that had always seemed impossible for me. Climate change is significant in our lives whether we realize it or not. It is time that we open our eyes to the suffering of others and understand the weight of the reality that we too face. That this is not enough to have compassion, that there must also be action.
So Munira was a student that we worked with, and she helped us to organize a youth day at the Capitol in Minnesota, and got to share her story in front of the governor and students from all over the state, which was really, really wonderful. And I really just love her story, just bringing in her personal experiences and her family, and sort of connecting to how that motivates her to want to get involved. And she was really afraid of public speaking, but sort of found that confidence in her voice and being able to share her story with others too, which was lovely. So I'd love to turn it back again and hear from folks about how you were thinking about how you could bring storytelling to your own class. Maybe what subject you teach or how you see that pulling in, or if there are actions that you want your students to engage with, how could you bring storytelling and connect to their lived experiences through those actions? And you can go ahead and post in the chat there too.
Hi, I'll share. So I actually teach at the university level, and I teach climate science and oceanography and a climate change course that's very interdisciplinary. We bring in speakers from all across the university to talk about their experiences with climate or how climate change relates to their research. And I really want to change that course to be more interactive. I'm a new faculty member and I took it over from an experienced faculty member, and I just finished teaching it for the first time and it wasn't nearly interactive enough. And so that's why I'm here today, because I really want to add something like this to my class. But one of the questions I have, just based on the one you just played, my students come from really privileged backgrounds, a lot of them, and they care deeply about climate justice and environmental justice, and they want to make a difference. But I guess how do I frame an activity like this for students who, they haven't felt the same kinds of hardships as that previous video showed?
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's a really good one.
Kira?
Yeah.
Can I just say one thing, speak to the privilege thing? That's my community as well. And I will say that and I teach middle schoolers, so college and middle school, different. But
Yeah.
But what is true is their ardor, right? They want justice, and they're in that position where they feel it should be attainable, which is something we can maybe capitalize on. My kids that I teach were in New Jersey when Sandy hit. And for the first time, they experienced, and at the time we were doing dystopian book clubs, and they experienced this thing that whether or not it was climate change, they were hearing those chats and they were thinking, this is sea level rise. I mean, they saw flooding in Manhattan, they saw it in their own neighborhoods. Many of them had. So I think that brought it home for them, even the privilege that they could rebuild their houses, but some of their neighbors couldn't afford to. I mean, there was just, it helped us. Not that I want a disaster to strike, but I'm just saying, anyway, there's always a personal story somewhere that can make someone feel something, I feel like.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Patricia. Yeah, and for your question too, I think, these are just some of the stories we can share. And in the storytelling lesson plan that Megan shared too, those are a few questions that we commonly use for helping people think about their personal climate stories, but are by no means the only questions you could ask. And so there's sort of a wealth out there of ways that you can pull in how students are thinking about climate change. It doesn't just have to be a lived experience of an impact that they felt, but maybe how they've been thinking about and processing climate change as they read it in the news or as they work on it for a class project. A climate story doesn't just have to be of impacts that you faced. And so I think, for them to be able to share their experiences of how they're thinking about climate change, but maybe not necessarily impacted themselves, I'm sure there are other students who are feeling that way too and would be able to connect to a climate story about that. So sort of like Danny's climate story, they can talk about something they love rather than a loss that they feel, and that really connects with people as well. So.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say too. I know that Kira, in work at Climate Generation, you say that a climate story is really your life story. So whatever anyone has experienced is true, is valid, and can be, it's figuring out how to connect it back to climate change. So it could be, more on the hope and solution side, rather than on the loss or the impact side. So there's just, I mean, I bet we could all have both sides, in our own lives that we experience, and maybe your students could look at the hope and solutions side. So yeah, good question.
Great. Well, I think we've got about 15 minutes left, and I just have a few other resources that I want to talk about and share. So let's see. All right, can you see the slides? Sorry, dealing with multiple desktops here.
Yeah, we see Munira's story. Oh yeah, there we go.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I just wanted to just sort of highlight some key takeaways, thinking about how to bring this into the classroom. So the first is that climate stories really help students to build confidence talking about climate change by connecting it to their own lived experiences. And like we just talked about, it can also be how they're thinking about climate change, or, any of their lived experiences can contribute to their climate story, because at the heart of it, it's a story about themselves. And so, everyone has a climate story to tell, and everyone's voice contributes to part of this movement. The second is that we know that students are critical messengers. So teaching students to talk about climate change, in class can lead to a ripple effect of having a greater impact on, maybe they talk about it with their parents who might be climate skeptics or climate deniers. So there's always ways that we can sort of have this ripple effect. We're all experts in our own experiences. So regardless of whether that's, yourselves as educators or with your students, bringing your own experience, telling that personal story as you talk, sharing vulnerably with your students yourself can allow them to feel more comfortable in sharing and reciprocation with you. So it can be really important to have that interaction go both ways as well. And then finally, that stories really help us connect the head and the heart, and sort of pulling out what our motivation is and how does that charge us to take action. And one example of this that we worked on that Megan mentioned, at Climate Generation, we put together a book called Eyewitness, Minnesota Voices on Climate Change, which was written by people all across the state of Minnesota and sharing their firsthand accounts of climate change through poetry, through stories, and through artwork. And while the stories are from, in this book are all from Minnesota, we really feel that the themes that are in this book are universal, spanning from gratitude to loss, responsibility, resilience, and hope. And so the book is sort of modeled over the spectrum of emotions that we feel and experience about climate change. And so an eyewitness in itself is sort of essentially a demonstration of literary activism. So we're hoping that this is sort of a testimony of climate change, and we're planning on delivering a copy of this book to every legislator in Minnesota, and sort of hope that this book will inspire others to think about their own climate story, and then how they can use that to write to their own legislator, to advocate for policy and climate solutions, at all sorts of scales. And so Megan said that the book is available for purchase on our website. It's climateeyewitness.org. But we also have select stories that are available online, audio versions of some of the stories that are available for free. And we've got some of the artwork with descriptions from the artists talking about how they created it and what the connection is to climate change, available on the website as well. And then we also have created an eyewitness toolkit for educators. And I think Megan will be able to post that link in the chat. And this past Earth Day, we did a live virtual storytelling slam with a bunch of the authors from this book, sharing their pieces out live. And our eyewitness toolkit sort of helps provides some structure for teachers to be able to go through and share the stories with their students, and then has some guiding questions to help students think about some of the themes from the different stories, how they could apply those to their studies or to their own life, and thinking about their personal climate story as well. So this is a resource that we hope that you'll find useful, and the preview or the replay of our live storytelling slam from Earth Day is available to watch online too, for free. Yeah. Oh, thanks, Megan, for linking the toolkit. Yeah, I think that's all I've got. And I mean, if anyone has any other questions, feel free to pop on and ask as well. And I can put my email in the chat if anyone has any questions or wants to reach out. You can feel free to connect with me.